the Decolonial Summer School 2021 Decolonizing body. This is the week 4, which is dedicated to talk about sexualities. We have a distinguished guest today. As you can see, Dr. Rahul Rao has joined to talk about sexualities today. I welcome Dr. Rahul Rao. He's senior lecturer in politics at School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Rahul is author of 2 books, Out of Time, The Queer Politics of Postcoloniality in 2020, and Third World Protest, Between Home and the World in 2010, both published by Oxford University Press. He has written numerous articles in the fields of international relations, post-colonial studies, and queer theory, and he is currently writing a book on the politics of controversial status. He is a member of the Radical Philosophy Collective and blogs occasionally at the Disorder of Things. He has research interest in international relations, post-colonial and queer theory, gender and sexuality, and South Asia. Welcome, Rahul. So today's discussion, the basic format is we will have an initial discussion with Rahul, and then we have some of our participants who are ready to talk about what they do in Sri Lanka. And also we will have a little break in between. And then we will talk more broader topics on sexualities and decolonizing sexualities. And also we will open the floor for questions and answers. We are hoping to record the session today, but when you talk, if you want to pause the recording, please let us know so that we can pause the recording, then we can avoid that specific part from recording. Without waiting further, we will invite Rahul. Rahul, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for joining us. Before we start the discussion, I would like to enter to the discussion by just asking about yourself. How did you start doing the research you do, and how do you identify yourself in terms of being a queer scholar, and perhaps what were your inspirations, events that led to this being in your position today? So would you like to talk a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Kaushi, for that wonderful introduction. It's really nice to see all of you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that we have today. So to answer your question, I started writing about these issues. I was born in Bangalore till the age of 23. I went to law school at National Law School of India. And I suppose it was there that I first began to think about sexuality as a legal and political issue, and also a personal issue, of course. As many thinking here about the late 1990s, the movement against Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code had been going on for about 5 or more years, depending on how you date these things by that point. And so I, as a law student, but also as somebody who was beginning to identify as gay, was very invested in that particular struggle and in the legal campaign. I remember our university was, I think, one of the first in India to host a workshop or a seminar on queer issues in 1997, I think. So from there onwards, I suppose I followed the Indian legal and political campaign against 377. Reached a kind of conclusion, although it'll be interesting to talk, I think, about whether these legal judgments are really conclusions or whether they open up new kinds of struggles and challenges and opportunities. But one sort of punctuation mark, if I can put it like that, was reached in 2018 when the Supreme Court ruled in Navtej Johar. It read down Section 377 so that it no longer criminalizes consensual adult same-sex sexuality. But after law school, I came to the UK, which is where I'm sitting right now, to do graduate study. And I moved from law to thinking about politics. And many people have asked me why that switch. And I suppose it's because when I was in law school, I began to think of the law. Well, I should say first that the curriculum where I went to law school was a combination of law and social science. And I think through that, I developed a view of law as the outcome of social and political struggles. Um, and in this way, I became more interested in those struggles that culminate in the law taking a particular shape. And then also at the struggles that try to reshape laws that are seen as oppressive and in need of change. So I suppose this is what led me to thinking about politics, and particularly the politics of struggle of social movements, as in some sense prior to, and therefore maybe more important than law. Maybe we should also discuss this more important or less important question, because I think law is a terrain of struggle. It's not the full stop. It's not the end point. So this is what led me to the study of politics, international relations, political theory, which is broadly, I would say, the combination of disciplines that I'm situated in. So my first book was about post-colonial protest in the big anti-colonial movements, but also more recently in anti-globalization politics and queer politics. And towards the end of that project, which was around 2009 to 2010, I heard about the Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act, which many of you may have heard of. This was an incredibly draconian piece of legislation, which proposed the death penalty for certain categories of offenses. Homosexuality was already criminalized by the Uganda Penal Code, which is also a British remnant of British colonial penal law. But this act was going to increase those penalties to the death sentence in certain situations in the first draft of the bill. That language changed subsequently. The other interesting thing, there are many interesting things about this bill, which became an act briefly in 2014. But the other thing that struck people's attention almost immediately was that US-based evangelical Christian activists were very heavily involved in lobbying for the passage of this bill, lobbying Ugandan priests and politicians and urging them to pass this law, because they said that this Western culture of gay rights was going to be a threat to the Ugandan family and family values, and a quite familiar, I think, queerphobic discourse that one hears in many parts of the global South. So this was an international story from the very outset. Both sides, if you can call them sides in this conflict, seem to be globalized. The queerphobic voices on the Christian right were transnationally organized. The queer activists were also transnationally organized. And Uganda seemed to be the arena in which this global struggle was playing itself out. So I suppose that's what drew me to trying to tell the story of this particular crisis, its global effects, its global ramifications. And that's how I came to write the book, Out of Time.
Thank you, Rahul. I think many of us in the room can relate to your stories. For example, when you talk about the law, and myself and Kiran, Hassana, we all coming from law background and now kind of moving towards more social and political studies. And also that I think a lot of our activists in this room today can relate to the what you said about homophobia. We can talk about it later, perhaps. So why you talked about the laws in Uganda, and then like how you see the problems and how what you see to be the relationship between theory and practice in your own work.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't see a sharp division between theory and practice, and I think that is because in the places that I was studying most closely for this book, India and Uganda, I think some of the first writing on queer life and queer life wars has been produced by people who thought of themselves as activists, or thought of themselves as both activists and scholars, because, and maybe this is true in Sri Lanka as well. So I, and because that was my starting point, those voices, those texts, those spaces, um, I did not think of theory and activism as two separate from each other. And if we look at the origins of gender studies as a discipline in university departments in the West or anywhere else, I think we can also see that some of the founding figures were also deeply involved in social movements. I shouldn't say were, are deeply involved in social movements and in legal reform, political struggle. So I think this is an area of scholarship and work and politics where that line has never been very sharp. And conversely, even those of us who think of ourselves as situated more in the university, I think want to have some impact in the world. We want the work to be useful. We want it to be read. We want it to help activists think through their dilemmas. Even when there is critique, we hope that it will be critique that strengthens the movement, makes it more self-reflexive. So I think even if one is coming more from a scholarly than an activist position, there is usually in this field an attempt to reach across that boundary. How successfully, I don't know. It depends, I think, from case to case and situation to situation. So I never really saw a sharp distinction. I think what happens is that when a particular context is heavily studied and theorized, let's take the US context, for example, then there tends to be a lot of scholarly production from that particular context, right? That work gets, a lot of work gets written or produced. It gets published by publishers with a far-reaching distribution networks. It gets read, it gets taken up, it gets cited. Other people who want to become experts in the field feel that they have to master it in order to establish their own credentials. And so this kind of work becomes what we call hegemonic, right? It becomes the standard that we all feel we need to understand or read or engage with or match up to or whatever. And that I think sometimes, so what happens is that particular experiences become generalized, and that's when theory is produced. Now, the theory in that abstract form, it can be useful, it can also be useless. And I think we have to be able to have a quite frank conversation about theoretical ideas and frameworks. How are they produced? Where are they produced? How do they travel? Are they useful in other contexts? If they are useful, what does it mean to apply them? Do we have to modify something? Do we have to change something about it before it makes sense in a different context? Or do we say, this doesn't really resonate with us because we have a different set of issues or problems? So I see it as a constant, it's like a dialectical thing. It's a tension. It's a constant two-way conversation. Practice produces abstract thought, which gets called theory. The theory moves around. Maybe it shapes or reshapes practice in some other place. And that other place also has the potential to generate theory. I say has the potential because I was trying to also alert us to, the structures that make certain places more visible and make them look like the place of theory, versus other places which are thinking very deeply about these issues, but somehow that thought doesn't get the same attention or doesn't travel in the same way. So yeah, that's maybe how I think of that relationship as a two-way relationship, as a power relationship, maybe as an unequal relationship. But that's how I think about it.
Thank you. Yes, very important point. Some may think, yes, theory is important. Then what if I feel it, I know it, but I really don't understand the theory? That is one of the questions that we often get from our colleagues, and even within us sometimes, myself. Yes, what if I feel it? It's my emotional way of understanding the world, but I really don't understand theory. So how do I balance this? We can talk about this more further when we have Q&A.
Can I quickly comment on that, Kaushi? Because I think what you said is very interesting, the inaccessibility of theory. It's something I've thought about quite a lot. Um, I think also we need to think about what are the genres in which we write, you know, what are the forms in which we are writing about these things. Um, I think it is more interesting and more egalitarian and more decolonial, since that's the spirit of this, this workshop and this summer school, to think that theory can be produced in many different terrains. So some of the most interesting work in queer studies actually is life writing and memoir and autobiography, or it's being produced in other idioms like film, or I'm sure there are many practitioners in this room who are working in these different media and these different genres. For me, that also is theory. It is also a site for generating theory. And at its best, queer theory has taken, I think, from all these different sources and has tried to think with it. So maybe if we think about theory more widely, then the question of access and accessibility can also look quite different. It doesn't have to be about understanding Judith Butler. One can arrive at the same insights reading or watching or doing something totally different. And in fact, we can also ask, are Butler's insights original? Or were they simply, well, not simply, there's a massive achievement there, but are they systematizing things that have been said in other ways and other places and other times? So I think I'm really, I like the fact that you have highlighted the point about access and accessibility. I think it's very important.
um, if you have questions, please note them down. You can raise at some point in this discussion, I'm sure. So Rahul, in your recent book, as you just now mentioned, that you have written about the anti-homosexuality law that's circulating in Ugandan Parliament between, I think, 2009, 10 to 14. So which came to be the focus of the global conversation about queer rights, and this law which intended to increase the penalties as a result of colonial laws. Interestingly, you discussed the Ugandan experience in conversation with India and UK, all three in some way connected to the experience of colonialism. And you also write about Homo Capitalism and HIV/AIDS movement in Uganda. Would you like to talk about your experience in Uganda and perhaps some similarities in with India, and also a little bit about Homo Capitalism you talk about in this book?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I'll try
Yeah.
and split it up into parts, and maybe we can go into each of them. So the first part, I think, is the three countries. Why these three countries, I think, would be something interesting to think about. So I think one answer I would say is accident. I'm from India. I was deeply affected by the Indian movement and involved in it and implicated in it. I could not but think about that and write about that. And I've done that episodically in different places. I'm living in the UK now, so it is impossible to ignore what's happening around me at this end. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2009 and 10, this seemed to be a very big story and one that could not be ignored. Uganda became, I think, the center of something global was happening, and I wanted to think about how that was manifesting. But then, as I thought separately about these three places, the links became a little bit more clearer. It's not a secret, of course, that all three are linked by the experience of British colonialism, and also that the colonial laws, the anti-queer laws, anti-transphobic laws in these places all have something to do with colonial legislation. So the Indian Penal Code was seen as a kind of pioneering legal instrument which actually codified criminal law in a way that had not even really happened in Britain. It was the colonies that were the laboratory, and then many of these technologies were re-imported whether it's, sanitation or laws like the Penal Code or other things. So the Indian Penal Code was a first of a kind, and its provisions was then exported to other colonies in sub-Saharan Africa. There is another model, the Queensland Penal Code in Australia, which also traveled in different ways. I'm speaking about these two because the anti-queer provisions of these penal codes were the models for many others. So then I realized maybe I'm telling a story about colonialism and the remnants, or what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlives of colonialism, as they manifest themselves in this particular issue. So that became one way to think about the connections, right, between the three countries. But as in the process of doing the research, you also asked a question about my experience of doing the research in Uganda. It's very interesting because Uganda, of course, has a big Asian community, a big Indian community, which has had a difficult political history in Uganda. People will know about the expulsion of the Ugandan Asians by Idi Amin and the way in which this generated displacement and movement. There are also very complicated issues around questions of race and racism, the racism of Indians against Black Africans, the racism of these expulsions. We can also ask, I think, interesting questions about caste, how caste travels through the Indian diaspora, how that caste also shapes attitudes towards race and racism. These are very, these are not questions I fully take on in the book, but when I start thinking about the connections between the three places, I think we start to begin to think also about movement of people between these three places, right? So I have a student, for example, who is studying, she's studying race and caste in Britain. And I'm not sure how many people will know this, but recently in the UK, there was a consultation around whether the Equalities law should include explicit recognition of caste discrimination as analogous to race. Ultimately, that consultation ended with the Conservative government deciding not to include caste as a explicit ground in Equalities law. The reason for this was a lot of lobbying by the Hindu upper caste, dominant caste community in the UK. Some of the key players here are from the community of Ugandan Asian people who were expelled from Uganda and made their life in Britain. So then you begin to think, how, again, connections between these three places manifest themselves in all kinds of ways, right? What is it about the particular attitudes around caste and race? How did they travel? How did they create these difficult relationships in different places? And how are they still manifesting themselves in these kinds of political disagreements? So we can tell other stories of connection. And then right towards the end of the book, I suddenly became very obsessed with Freddie Mercury, because anyone who knows Freddie Mercury's story knows that this is somebody, a Parsi with Bombay connections, who actually spent some part of his life in India, who grows up in Zanzibar and ends up in Britain. And this seemed to me another queer story connecting the three countries, and a queer story that can be told in so many different registers. You can tell a tragic story, you can tell an exuberant story of this incredible rock star who who's not been matched in virtuosity and so forth. So it became like there were these infinite ways of connecting the three countries, and I've only scratched the surface, and there's a lot of interesting work on diaspora that I think does a much better job. So in my book, the three places are somewhat side by side. The connections are not fully illuminated, but I think there's a lot to say there. You mentioned Homo Capitalism. So let me just briefly talk about the concepts. I think there are two concepts that are very central to the book. One is Homo Nationalism, which is Jasprit Puar's concept, which she articulates in a 2007 book, Terrorist Assemblages. This is, of course, one of the key texts in queer theory, particularly queer of color theory, coming out of the US Academy. her big idea in that book is that LGBT rights have become a kind of new way of marking the divide between the civilized and the savage. I think of this idea alongside Edward Said's Orientalism. You could say that LGBT rights has become a new way of marking Orientalist divides in the world. It's this technology by which LGBT activists try to persuade states that they need to reform if they are to appear civilized as opposed to barbaric, right? And so in this sense, it operates in very problematic ways, particularly in the United States, where the US government is urged to become more progressive in order to distinguish itself from fundamentalist Islam and so on and so forth. And so LGBT activists, in offering this kind of argument, also end up being racist and perpetuating these geopolitical racist divides and divisions. This is Puar's critique. Now, to this, I add the concept of Homo Capitalism, which is something I observed looking at some of the global reactions to the Ugandan Anti-Homosexuality Act. One of the biggest, most prominent reactions came from the World Bank, which a few days after the passage of this act in 2014, withdrew a $90 million loan that was meant to have funded maternal health projects in Uganda as a kind of punishment for the act. You could say this is a new kind of conditionality, gay conditionality. And this aroused a lot of debate. Some people were for it. Many people were against it. Many LGBT activists in Africa wrote an open letter saying, of course, we appreciate international solidarity and support, but this is the wrong way to manifest it, because this kind of conditionality actually makes us scapegoats. It makes us look even more like agents of Western imperialism. It becomes an excuse for wealthy donors and financial institutions to stop providing aid, and we get blamed for these aid flows drying up. So our position is even more endangered and embattled because of these kinds of interventions. But as I say earlier, the activists were divided because some people were for this kind of pressure. Simultaneously, the World Bank was also pioneering these studies which claim to show that if a country recognizes LGBT rights, its GDP would grow by X%. These are quantitative studies, literally saying if your country recognizes one right, your GDP will grow by so much. And the argument is basically that by recognizing these rights, queer citizens will, not suffer discrimination, not have healthcare issues, be able to be contributing citizens to the economy, etc. In some ways, very good arguments. Who can criticize the entry of people into work and livelihood and so forth? But my critique in the book is that this is becoming a new way in which elite LGBT activists seem to be trying to persuade states to change, using money or capital as the carrot or the stick, right? If you do this, then your economy will grow, capitalism will become more dynamic. If you do not do this, then we will withdraw aid. So capital becomes the carrot and the stick. And so I'm suggesting that it's not just these moral ideas of civilization and barbarism, it's also economic ideas of prosperity and poverty that are being invoked to persuade states to change their ways. Why is this a problem? It could be a problem if you think capitalism is a problem, right? If you think that capitalism is a problem and the World Bank's ways of perpetuating a certain vision of capitalism are a problem, then I'm not sure the World Bank can be your friend. I'm not sure that you can ride the capitalist wave in order to achieve a human rights objective. So that's the nature of the argument. Of course, it's more complicated than that, and we can talk about that critique. I'm suddenly noticing a lot of comments in the chat. So should we go to the chat or? Oh, okay. Yeah. Thanks for adding the references. That's really helpful. Thank you.
When you talk about this Ugandan HIV/AIDS experience, I wanted to share one kind of similar experience that we faced a few years back from Sri Lanka. So one of the leading LGBTIQ organizations based in Colombo actually wrote to the European Union. It's happened like maybe 5 years ago. So as you're aware that in there is a certain quota that the European Union every year they give a quota for garment factory products to export. So this leading organization, they have a lot of connections with all the embassies and the UN, and also with all these donor agencies, and one of the most resourceful organizations in Sri Lanka. They actually wrote to the European Union to stop the quota for until the government decriminalize LGBTIQ, the penal code, requesting them to stop the quota for decriminalization. It didn't work anyway, but there were a lot of criticisms against that. You write to the donor, the the European Union, asking to punish the government. So I just came across my mind when you explained this situation. I see a lot of similarities in this situation as well.
That's very interesting. Can you remind me when did this happen? When was this going on?
This was 2000. I mean, I might be able to find some links for you.
Yeah.
If you have any idea which year, I think you might remember this incident. You know which organization I'm talking about. No idea. No.
Because it sounds like multiple things might have been happening at the same time. This Ugandan situation is the one I noticed, but it would be interesting if similar ways of using economic coercion have happened in different places. It'll be really interesting to kind of put them together and to see when this phenomenon emerged as a tactic.
I'll try to find some links. Kiran says it's 2018, but as far as I remember, it was 2016 or 17 when the previous government was in power. I think I'm not sure. I'll find it out. Yes. So before we move on to next questions, I would like to listen to some of our participants' experience in activism. Who wants to go first? Hasana, Ephraim, Siva, any of you can talk. Okay, Pavitra has a question, I think. Pavitra, do you want to take the question now, or do you want to wait until the end of the session?
Not a question.
Yes, Pavitra, yes.
It's actually some that would contribute to the previous discussion
sure, go ahead.
of an incident. And I think it also quite, I mean, I now understand that particular incident through Homo Capitalism idea. I was in New Zealand doing my higher studies. In 2018, they had, the annual LGBTI World Conference, something like that, organized in Wellington, the city that I was living in. And I had some of my friends from Sri Lanka who told me that they'll be coming to that conference. So I was quite happy to meet them there. So, we had this communication, and ultimately I got to know one of my friends who was a trans woman did not get her visa approved by New Zealand. And she was quite, we all were like really surprised to see that, because she had all these, visa requirements. She was a UK resident. So it didn't make any sense to us why her visa was not approved. And then we had some, sneaky, investigations, and we realized that New Zealand government is very reluctant to approve visas for trans men and women, with the I think the fear that if they get into the country, they'll then seek for asylum, saying that this is particularly so it's not just for the Sri Lankan trans woman that this happened, but also Pakistan transgender woman. But gay, I had a gay friend, he got the visa. So we assume that through the visa documents, visa officers cannot, they can easily identify trans people, not the other gays. So that I thought, I mean, I was quite shocked to see that New Zealand being this, very politically correct and morally, and that kind of a country, being very, regulatory about, who's coming in and this. So I think Homo capitalism really explains that situation.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and it also resonates with some other instances I've heard. I think one of the other things that it brings up for me is that many of the same countries which are proud to speak about themselves as champions of LGBT rights seem to be quite unwilling when it comes to asylum. So even genuine asylum cases, you're not talking about an asylum case. You're talking about a case where they feared that somebody would apply for asylum, but even where people have explicitly applied for asylum in the UK, there's a very poor record of the state giving asylum. And in fact, there's a lot of very disturbing jurisprudence on, there are a few progressive higher judgments that have, at one time, the legal position was that if people could disguise their sexuality, then their country of origin did not pose a threat. So people were basically obliged to live in the closet, and this was considered okay. Then there was a judgment a few years ago, I can't remember which year exactly, which said you cannot expect people to, to hide their sexuality. This is a human rights violation, and this cannot be a ground to deny asylum. However, despite that higher court ruling, and maybe this takes us back to the question of law and social change, despite that higher court ruling, at the lower level of the asylum adjudication process, people were routinely being asked to prove their sexuality. How does one do that, right? But to prove your sexuality, or they were regularly disbelieved even when they provided evidence, or, it's almost like because there was a progressive higher judgment, the state could say things have changed now, but the devil is always in the detail. It's in the day-to-day practice. It's in the, the spaces of governmentality that are not so visible. And there, I think there is often a different story, not just in the UK, of course, but this is a problem we all face wherever we are.
Kiran, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to pick up on the point that Rahul was just making, I think in relation to asylum cases, and Sinthuran Raj has written his PhD, and which has now come out as a book, I think, about this. But even when I was doing immigration work, and we were dealing with asylum cases in Australia, I mean, the other thing that's very interesting, which is a question I hope we can discuss in a minute, is when people are asked to prove their gayness, the markers of what is truly gay, they have a very particular idea of what gayness should look like. So I remember we had a case where it was a Punjabi woman who'd come from the village in Punjab, and her case was refused because in the hearing she was asked which gay bars she'd been to on Oxford Street, which, for a start, Oxford Street is super expensive in the city centre. It's also very white and very gay man friendly. It's not a place that lesbians hang out. And the idea that this woman, because she came from the village, that her performance of her sexuality would be the same as basically, an urban dwelling, white, middle-class gay man, was never called into question at all, and then they wanted her to speak very openly and explicitly about what sort of sexual practices, which again, not taking into account at all that you ask anybody coming from the Punjab to speak very openly about their sexual practices, they're not going to be able to do it. And the assumption that, this would be the proof of being properly gay or properly lesbian. I mean, I think this is another way in which, there's things to be said about whether there is a universal idea of what this sexuality should look like, but also then how the law, in the process of taking up these issues, how it also adopts these very black and white definitions, and how it it can be very restrictive in its understanding and actually produce more problems than it solves, even when it is recognized, even when things are recognized within law. So anyway, I would love to talk a bit more about this later. Sorry for jumping in.
Yeah, just to add a footnote to that, even the very progressive judgment that I mentioned has this line in it where the judge says, the judge is saying people shouldn't be obliged to hide themselves. But he says, if somebody wants to go to a Kylie concert or drink colorful cocktails, they should be able to. So even in the process of vindicating LGBT rights, this is the image of LGBT identity that the judge has. And so you can imagine, asylum tribunal adjudicators operating with a similar evidentiary standard where they ask questions like the one you mentioned, or, what magazines do you read, and expecting a certain set of answers, or can you show us photographs of yourself in a club or something like that?
Yeah, last week we talked about some examples of um, um, the real life test that the psychiatrist asked the trans folks here, like, what kind of work you do at home, what kind of, what shows you like, what books you read, what movies you watch. Like, the psychiatrist is the one who assesses the transgenderness in Sri Lanka in order to change your documents. So that those are the silly kind of, questions that they used to interrogate people who come to their clinics, asking, to get a measurement of how this person is successfully transferred or not. Yes, so we will go to the next section of our conversation. We have some of our participants who wants to talk about their activism and the challenges they face. Who wants to go first? Hasana?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kaushik.
Hasi, are you okay with,
yes.
with the recording? Should I keep anyone who's any participant who wants me to pause the recording at any stage, just let me know, okay?
Yeah. Thanks, Kiran. Thank you, Rahul. So I was able to connect so I'm Hasana, and I have a legal background, but I am mostly into activism. And I work on Muslim personal law reforms and also on queer activism. So very interestingly, so after reading and hearing some of your YouTube videos, I was Googling about the Uganda's bill. And it's so sad to see that they have brought in back, it's on the 3rd of May again, in the name of Sexual Offences Bill, and the Parliament has passed it. Still, President's signature is pending. Whereas again, they are criminalizing same-sex marriages and also HIV. If someone have consent sexual relationship with someone who has HIV, and if the other person gets it, and then that person will be penalized, put in jail. And the worst part is, if the family members are not going to tell about the queerness to the police, and the family members are going to be put in jail, is what they have added to this bill. Is really it's going to scatter the community and the families, break them up. So it's such a ridiculous, very bad a bill. And also I came across another point I noted when I was going through this bill, how this colonial period had brought in this law, just like this sodomy law in Sri Lanka. Also in penal code they have it. So it was earlier only for men, right? And then when they tried to change it in 1995, they included women. Just like that in Uganda in 1894, they introduced it and it was only men. And when they tried to change it in the year 2000, they have included women, right? So how, I see lots of similarities, in the same issues and how they are bringing it. It was really interesting in a way, but at the same time was irritating too. Yeah. The other point you raised about these GSP, how they impose government, the Homo Nationalism. I'm sorry, I had to get there. I'm not used to this. Homo Capitalism, right? So I can, so I told you that So for everyone, so I work on Muslim personal law reforms also. We've been seriously working on that issues. And one of the main point they picked up was to abolish child marriages. So in the year 2017, so I think it could be the same year as Kaushi, which Kaushi also mentioned on the queer activism. So in 2017, there was a pressure on the government in the good governance where they said for the state too, only Muslim children are allowed to marry under the age of 18. For everyone else, it is 18, over the 18 or over 18 years. So they brought in and said, don't grant this GSP plus that privilege until otherwise they change the Muslim personal law reform and ban child marriages. So, so that also so most of the Muslim activists, they were very happy, right? Though they are very critical about capitalism, though they are very critical about, the government or the politics, or most of them are like left activists, but they were pushing the government to, abolish child marriages because they've been trying it for more than 35 years. The Muslim activists have been wanting the reform for more than 35 years. They have tried it within the community, with the politicians. So everywhere they failed, right? So then this was the chance. They were trying each and every chance is like, how to stop these child marriages for the Muslim children, right? So, but it didn't work that way. We still have it, and we are trying to still asking to reform the law. So I was able to connect that also, how we see that GSP plus with the, it's not queer, actually, not the queer issue, but still how one kind of oppression or one kind of discrimination, we still depend on this economy and see that. Another point you raised, I was able to connect with my activism was how you mentioned that the same point, how some of the activists supported it, some were against that. So even in like what happened in India when they were asked to change triple talaq under the Modi government, so there was a backlash. It is the Hindu nationalist government is trying to take away the rights of the Muslims, but whereas there were lots of Muslim women have been asking to abolish that triple talaq, it was a total oppression on them, so much discrimination on them, right? So how do you balance it there, right? So we've been wanting same happening here now, right? So when Muslim activists have been asking for a long time, more than 35 years, to reform these laws, but now a Buddhist nationalist state is ready to reform it, not because Muslim women want it, because they want one law, one country. We will benefit from them, from the idea, yes, right? Because that is what we want. But it's not because of all our activism or all our demands. It's because of they have some other agenda. So do we feel happy about it, or do we go against it, or do we support it? And how the community is going to see us again, already attacking, and now how the community is going to see is another point. So why I'm saying this is I want to bring it to another activism. Sorry, do I have time? Another 5 minutes? Okay,
yes,
thanks.
yes.
Yeah, thanks. So another activism, because I very strongly believe in intersectionality, right? So that is the core for, I think the fight against discrimination should be, come together as an intersectional idea. So everyone must be knowing in 2019, there was an attack, Easter attack. After that, there was lots of attack on the Muslims, on the Muslim community. So there was many misunderstandings or fear within the feminist, women's rights activists as well. We've been working for a social change, for many working with different communities, with Muslims, Tamil, Catholics, but that was very critical period and we could feel it. And also we realized that I work with in the Tamil speaking areas in the northeast and mostly northwestern part of the country. So where we realize women activists very strongly work on for violence against women. Some work on the issue of disability. Some work on the issues of queer. Some work on the issues of, child marriages, Muslim reforms, right? So we felt that, myself and there was another friend and two other friends together, we wanted to come together and bring everyone together and discuss, not to discuss each and every issue separately. That's how they are doing activism, and it has become, we're seeing it as a failure, right? So how we all can come together and talk about everyone's issues. So we planned, and after the Easter attack, we really felt that there is a need, and we organized, and I could see most of the friends here, like Ephraim, Karthi, I'm not sure whether Shiva was there, no. So many friends together, right? No, they like from different parts, central to peripheries, we invited all of them to come together. And that was the first time. There were lots of Muslim women on one side. There were queer friends from the community. There was displays of different sexualities where they were seated, they were talking about, they got chance to speak to trans people, trans women, and then women talking to them, and they're just like us. Why there is a big fuss about this issue in the country, right? So we realized that there's not a chance also not given. Like, so some friends still say that when we talk now, so one of the activism, what we do is to bring all the intersectionalities together and to work for a social change. So that's what we are trying. And many of the friends also who are here, we believe in that as well, I hope. And I'm so happy that we come together in that thought. And just one more point to say in that. Now how we do activism is, so there are queer communities working for the queer issues. And also we have different multiple conversations with the women's rights group where we talk about, so that hasn't been part of the activism so far. So now we have started to talk about sexualities, decolonizing sexuality, decolonizing gender. So that is like, though they are working on violence against women, now they know, right? And also we question, when I come and talk for someone from an oppressed caste, so why this is happening? No one questions me. Are you from that caste? Why are you talking for that caste? And everyone is like, yeah, we have to talk about, see, this much of discrimination happening. Yeah, we have to support them, they feel. Violence against women, oh, really? Yeah, we have to do something for them. Child abuse, we have to do something for them. When you come talk about, nobody comes talk about queer, like, sexual discrimination, sexualities. When they come and talk, are you also this? That's how they ask. So they don't say, okay, it is another category of discrimination, another ground for discrimination. So why you separate this sexuality? You are in favor of, and you will support ethnicity, race, class, any other language. You are just there like a big fighter. But when it comes to sexuality, everyone takes a backseat. No. And they don't even want to say something in support also, even on social media, right? I think that makes even the people from the queer community also be closet, not free, they don't have that support, even in the community or even in the social change. So I stopped there and I will lead with others. But thank you for listening.
Thank you, Hasi, for like very insightful reflections. So that question is also there. The first question that Hasi asked. So, if asking the international donor communities to put more conditionalities, if it is the only window that we can achieve our right, is it wrong, or how do we see it? And if the necessary law reforms are a part of nationalist agenda of the government, how do we respond to that? I mean, it's a very important question Hasi raised. Rahul, would you like to respond to Hasi?
Yeah, thank you so much, Hasina, for that really inspiring account of the work that you're doing. So I think, many of the things you said I'm very interested in, especially this dilemma that Kaushi also is highlighting. This is when, if we can, in a situation where we are trying to achieve a particular objective, Are there limits on the kinds of actors that we can ally with, or should we accept help from wherever it comes? The problem, I think, is that when we accept help, we are, it becomes like a bargain. Nobody does anything for free. And I think when one accepts solidarity from a particular source, you become implicated with that actor. You become tied up with them in some way. You become part of their agenda. I think the example you gave of Muslim personal law and the abolishing child marriage and the triple talaq, that's a very interesting situation, because it really illustrates what's at stake. I'm familiar with how these debates are playing out in India, where the Hindu right poses as a champion of gender equality by promising uniform civil code. And of course, feminists have been critiquing personal law of different religious communities for a long time, and have, for their own independent reasons, articulated need for a uniform civil code. What happens when they appear to say the same thing, but they are coming from totally different places? Are they allies, or is there something else going on here? So interestingly, I just read the triple talaq judgment a couple of weeks back. I read Shaira Bano versus Union of India, I think. What is very interesting about the judgment for me is that, so the Chief Justice in the case says, actually he's in the minority. He's the Chief Justice, but it's the minority opinion. He says, personal law is part of freedom of religion. We cannot interfere with it. If at all there is any interference, the legislature has to do it. Court cannot do it. That's it. But the majority judgment is very interesting, because what they do is they actually read the Quran and the Hadith, and they argue that talaqi biddat, that is the instantaneous triple talaq, is un-Islamic. And this is the method through which they suggest that this is not an essential part of religion, it's custom. And custom is not protected by the constitutional freedom of religion provision. Only the essentials of the religion are. So this is an interesting method for me, because it upholds religious freedom. It is ostensibly not Islamophobic, because there is some deference to Islamic belief and faith and practice. But it's also attentive to the gender politics, to the way in which triple talaq is being used, to the anxieties that Muslim women have experienced. I'm not saying it's a perfect judgment, but for me, what it shows is that the method of reasoning, is as important as the destination. And if we can get there through a method, through a pathway that is faithful to all our values and does not sacrifice one for another, then I think we're in a better place. So I suppose I'm just saying the means are as important as the end when we think about these alliances and solidarities and so forth. But then you describe this intersectional space, the coming together of different groups. And I think what you described is the exceptionalization of sexuality. It shows that it's still an unpopular cause, right? People are not willing to stick their necks out for it. And when they do, there's severe sanction or criticism. And this is very interesting, because I think it shows us, queerness is not just about sexuality, right? It can be understood as any kind of deviation from the normal. I think in some places where sexuality has become less controversial, you could say that to be gay is no longer to be queer, right? It's normative, it's accepted, the whole society is okay with it, whatever. I don't think any society is like that, but there are places where they think they are. But I think what you're showing is that non-normative sexuality is queer in certain contexts. And it means, for me, it means that those issues need, all the solidarity that they can get. In fact, that is the argument for prioritizing it as a ground for activism. It's very difficult to do. I don't have any answers for that situation. I think it shows how we have to insist on inserting sexuality into the conversation precisely in those places where it is unpopular, because otherwise what is activism for, right? It's not for popular causes where people accept the claim. It's for those situations where there isn't support. And it sounds like that's the work you're doing, which is incredible.
Yes, it's a very important point that the method is also important as well as the end result. So we recently faced a similar dilemma, if I may add, taking 2 minutes. Few months ago, I think it was 2 months ago, there was a proposal coming from the current government, which is very, Sinhala Buddhist and very nationalist government, for the legal reforms for decriminalizing homosexuality in a certain way, not completely taking it off, but reforming it. So then they consulted few of our activists, and then we had the meeting whether to support this or not, and we don't know what the purpose behind it, whether this reform will take us to another level of discrimination, or whether is it purely with a good intention or not. So we had this dilemma, and we had several meetings, hours and hours, this just discussing not the proposals, but whether to support this or not. But ultimately it didn't happen because of the COVID and all. So they stopped all the law reforms at the moment. Yes, with that, I would like to, do you want to go for a break, Rahul, or would you like to continue with our next participant?
I'm okay to continue for a bit longer, and then
Is everyone okay with that? Okay, looks everyone is okay. So we would like to invite our next.
Hi, Kaushi.
Yes. Who is
Isuru here.
Yes,
May I make an observation,
yes,
if that is okay?
Sure, Isuru, go ahead.
So no, I just wanted to add something to what Hasina was talking. Sorry, I got disconnected in the middle. So now, basically my research. So hi Rahul, I'm Isuru here. I'm a visually challenged person. I'm a lecturer at the University of California. So my research more or less lies with the disability community. So one of the studies that I'm currently invested in is examining the challenges caused by the online education upon female undergraduates with disability. So actually, like what Hasina said, that resonated with what I was doing as well, because now it's not only a single identity marker that hinders people, because now we have to like look at them in a very intersectional manner where we cross cut things and try to understand and situate ourselves. That that idea, that reality struck me hard during that experience. And also another thing, I'm not that my research still is not going towards the direction of like queer, but I also think that how the desire being experienced by disabled persons, especially in Sri Lanka, is something that I would like to look at. But also something else that I thought that would be interesting is how conditioned people are, because now, especially when you are interviewing female undergraduates and when you are like trying to see their responses, trying to get them to talk, especially what the challenges that they face, it's really hard. Like they are really not sometimes willing to open up for discussion and to reveal their experiences, which I personally saw as some kind of a challenge. You may also have come across such situations, but I just wanted to make an observation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isuru. Rahul, you will respond.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting observation, Isuru. And I think what it's showing us is that intersectionality is often the need for it is felt when the pre-existing communities do not satisfy the needs of a community, right? So I can imagine a situation where the disability community may be quite male-oriented, or the feminist community may be quite able-bodied oriented. And so this intersectional disability feminism becomes necessary, and it sounds like that's the work that you're doing. But I also thought the point you made about conditioning is really interesting and important, that people are conditioned to maybe to accept less than what they are due. And the work of activism and politics becomes about consciousness raising or raising expectations, in a sense, and encouraging people to feel that they can demand more. I think that's such an important part of what activism is and does. Is that what you were getting at when you were talking
Yeah,
about how people
yeah,
are conditioned?
yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, like, yeah, through activism, I also believe that like people, I mean, like it's one thing that we have to focus on. Like we have to empower the community to come up and discuss, because like when you are dealing with several issues of marginalization, it's really hard for a person to come in because they feel vulnerable. So in that situation, like activism should focus on that as well. Thanks for that observation. Thank you.
Mm.
Thank you very much, Isuru. Who wants to go next? Siva? Yes, Siva.
And Siva, you're okay with me recording?
Yeah.
Okay, just checking.
Thanks. So all these times we have been talking about the tension between maybe, the laws and policies and people's practices. But from my activism, like the tension, since it's been there, I want to talk about the other side because my activism is based on that, more or less. So there is a saying which I'm not quite sure about, but they say that bad people, produces bad politicians. Likewise, people's, ideas or concepts or their beliefs in a way reflect on the laws, policies that are produced. At least, maybe the majority of the people's ideas are reflected at least on the laws and policies. So I'm Siva, I'm Sivadarshini, and you were also talking about switching to different subjects from one another. So I studied biology, zoology, and then became interested in sociology, politics. Later, when I was in India, I happened to see the lives of Dalit people, and I was able to personally experience some of the lives of young Dalit children and women. So from that, what I wanted to share is, like, for me, my activism is based on, personal change and also change in the families and also friends before moving to social change. So I think it's been equally challenging as it is, changing the structures. So for me, I've been personally reflecting on my own privileges. At the same time, in different ways, I become a victim of the oppressions. So thus, it in a way enabled me to all the time reflect on my own behaviors and attitudes towards other people. At the same time, how I oppress other people. At the same time, to navigate through these different types of oppressions that is imposed on me. And also, I think it's been really challenging to, convince or to spread the knowledge or the awareness to the family and friends, maybe outside of the activist circle, So I think that is also more important, and it's been really, really challenging. But at the same time, what I see is our participation is more important. So as part of, I think, for many women, for many, LGBTQI people, one of the things that they lack in a country like Sri Lanka is maybe like, like leaders. I don't know whether I can use that, but in order to motivate themselves or in order to come out and, and be strong, they lack that community feeling and supportive network. So I think it, as part of my activism, I connect these individuals to the community, thereby enabling them to have a supportive network through which they gain support and strength, and to, in a way, if they are empowered or if they feel that they want to openly express their identity, then that helps them. And also, I think it is inclusion is more important, and in the dominant structures, there have been women as well as people from LGBTQI community have been, excluded for a long time. So including them or making sure that they have the opportunity if they want to participate in a discussion or in a program is also part of my activism. But I think, like in different phases of my life, I've been committed to certain things. So my activism itself is not limited to one thing, because I also see that my studies, education, and life commitments in a way makes it fluid, so that, like I'm not, in fact, just limited to one type of activism. But at the same time, I also observe that, like, as an activist, like, I also noticed that, like, I have my own personal, limitations. So challenging that is really difficult. But at the same time, I think that it's really important that we do that. So, for example, as women, like, it has been believed that women are limited to household work or home. But at the same time, even though we now talk about these, different problems, I would say that maybe most of us, like, we do our household work and we come and discuss. So we find our own spaces to discuss about these things. So it is also about involving men in the household activity. At the same time, we take part in the public space, movements, collectives. And I also want to say that I was part of a political maybe movement for a while, even though I'm not really active in that. I think it's really, really important that we also take part in such, though there are many criticisms, just because that, there are criticisms, we shouldn't be limited to that. Like, we need to, in a way, broaden up the space that was previously, designed or enabled for us. Other than that, so these are some of the things. And in terms of challenges, I wanted to mention that, so when it comes to Tamil nationalism, or as a Tamil woman, it's been said that your priority must be ethnic problem, So as we discussed about the intersectionality, it's not just my ethnic identity oppressed me all the time. Maybe as a woman who have to work or do household at home, I've been oppressed, or I've been experiencing more of my gender identity than my, So I think I was able to, in a way, resonate with what you have been discussing so far. But I think how I am navigating the challenges, or how I am dealing with the challenges, there are many criticisms, many challenges, but at the same time, due to the time limitation, I don't want to talk about all of that, but I want to say that it's really the best way I handle my challenges is to navigate through them one by one, case-to-case basis, because, like all of what you have been sharing, different cases, but at the same time, like there are benefits and there are problems. So I think, like, I don't know how to come to a common ground. And I think it's not even necessary that we have to come to a common decision on that. So I think that's how I deal with these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siva, for sharing your insights. Any responses to Siva?
Yeah, a lot of interesting things, Siva. Thank you for those comments. I think one of the things you started with was this idea that people get the politicians they deserve. So maybe people also get the laws that they deserve. And how do we think about that? You know, I've always puzzled about how law relates to society, because I'm never very sure whether the law simply reflects current social opinion or whether the law is actually has the potential to run ahead of society and actually change society. Probably there are examples of both. So I think in the Indian case with sexuality, the Supreme Court was actually catching up with social opinion in 2018. There had been a very regressive judgment in 2013, and there had been so much criticism of it. I think there was embarrassment, and I think the court found that it had a second chance to kind of redeem itself. And in 2018, it was catching up. But equally, there are other issues where maybe the law has been ahead of social progress. So, for example, abolition of untouchability. In India, such a caste-ridden society, many of the anti-caste laws are running ahead of social opinion. And this is a good and necessary thing, because without that change, the social change would be even slower than it has been so far. So it's a very tricky thing. I can't come down neatly on one side or the other of that, what you've illustrated. You also said very interesting things about, how change and activism in some ways starts at home, right? We start where we are. But in many ways, the home is the most difficult arena, right? It can be more difficult than the more further away, abstract, state-oriented. In some ways, I don't want to say it's easy, because many people live in very, very difficult state environments where the state is genocidal or, arbitrary arrest, detention, disappearance, all of those things that I know people are dealing with. But the home can be a very difficult place because, I don't need to say why. Everybody in this room knows about the intimate violence and domestic violence, but also changing the attitudes of those one has grown up with can be the hardest thing, because one is not supposed to do that, especially when with hierarchies of age and gender and, all of these things. So I definitely hear you. I think also very interesting in what you said is how one can be both privileged and oppressed, and how does one navigate between those different positionalities. For me, thinking about race and caste together has helped me to make sense of this a little bit. The ways in which I enjoy caste privilege in India or even in the Indian community in the UK versus or next to the being a person of color in a white majority society, right? It's not a simple positionality. And very often moving rapidly from one situation to another, it can be quite disorienting. Suraj Yengere recently in The Caravan wrote a very interesting piece where he talked about how Savarna Indians, dominant caste Indians in the West, often will talk only about racial oppression, masking their caste privilege. And in this way, they are able to pose as the victims and not deal with the more difficult questions about their privilege. I think a version of this problem exists everywhere in some shape or form. And it's something that, we all have to deal with. And I think talking about it, acknowledging it, but then one also has to take a further step, I think, beyond that. So you talked a lot about inclusion, and I think that's very important. We need to think also about what inclusion means. I think that institutions find a certain kind of inclusion is very easy. You can change the text of a policy. You can say, discrimination is outlawed. You can change the language. You can formally include people. But when is inclusion truly meaningful? I think it's maybe more meaningful when the conditions for equal participation have been created. sometimes that requires, usually I think it requires some degree of material redistribution of power. I'm not just talking about money, I'm also talking about the ability to access the space, right? And so this may take us back to also disability questions, or it might take us to questions about accessibility, which Kaushi started with, the accessibility of theory, the accessibility of the classroom. I think all of these things are dimensions of inclusion, which we've got to keep working on. And then finally, I think very important is you reflected on the different dimensions of your own identity and how sometimes one aspect of identity feels more salient or more significant than another because of the context, because of the situation. It's very difficult to draw up a list and say, first I'll do this, then I'll do that. Because as we move through life, I think different aspects of our identity are called up by the situation that we're placed in. And yeah, I think you're helping us think through that complexity and how to respond to it. And I think maybe you're right, that maybe one doesn't need a kind of master framework where we are able to say, this is how I'm going to integrate all these things, or this is the order of priority in which I'm going to deal with each of these identities. But instead, to respond in a kind of, in a situational, contextual way. But then I think the issue is that the way one responds in one context, if it begins to contradict the way one responds in another context, then the situation can become very difficult, right? And this also maybe goes back to the ends means question. If the means that we use are in some sense in tension with some of the ends, then the activism can become unsustainable. And this is often what provokes big disputes. And there's no way around that, but I think this is what we tend to see in a lot of activist spaces, at least that I'm familiar with.
Thank you. And when you talk about home, I think for especially LGBT and queer activists, home is the most difficult place to grapple with, including myself. You know, a lot of my friends who are queer activists are like, you know, not out to the home, but to the society in a way.
Yeah.
We have two questions from Mathura and Vishani and Hasana also. So Mathura.
Yeah, good evening to you all. Just my question is, when it's, as a law student, I used to observe these things. When it's come into sexuality, I used to observe two things, especially one is sexual abuses. It includes the sexual bribery also. At the same time, the second one is the domestic violences. Normally, these two things are always applying for this woman and especially children, right? Even in our, as a law student, in our Sri Lankan penal code, we can see that the sexual abuse, especially these statutory traits, are offense in our country. But though we have law, but there are things occurring, like the minor child rape and everything is taking place. But we have law, so that laws are not implemented. So that these kind of issues are the major part when it's coming to sexuality, especially in women and children, especially, and moreover, these domestic violences. If you see these remote outside areas, or whether they have educated family or not, they are having these domestic violences. So we can apply those things here also. So I think these two reasons we can be able to point out that when it's coming to sexuality, these issues are taking major part of the sexuality, especially women and children. Is it okay? Just I want to clarify that.
I'm not sure I fully understood the question. So I think what you were saying was that the issues of sexual abuse and bribery and domestic violence mostly affect women and children. I would say that it can affect other kinds of people as well. So queer and trans people face all kinds of domestic violence. They may identify in many different ways, but I think that also needs to be part of the conversation. So I would, again, going back to the question of inclusion, I would like to have a conversation that can acknowledge, the range of sexual violence that is happening in society, and maybe these different forms of violence demand different kinds of responses. But also, I think they offer the possibility of solidarity between these different groups because they're dealing with something that has elements in common. So I think I would want to widen the conversation beyond women and children, even if they disproportionately suffer the violence in a society.
I would also like to add that when you think of inclusivity, sometimes it can be tricky. As Hasana mentioned, in 1995, they wanted to, make it gender neutral, the law. But then ultimately what happened was the lesbians were, they were penalized. So it can be really tricky.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's a really good point. And also this issue has been very controversial in thinking about rape law reform as well, the question of gender neutrality. And so I'm aware of how divisive those debates have been. But on the question of lesbian sexuality, I think what Hasana has alerted us to is how the law kind of moves between two extremes, right? Either the total erasure of lesbian sexuality, where the law cannot even imagine that this is something that is possible, or the criminalization of lesbian sexuality as culturally inauthentic, etc., etc. It seems like those are the only two criminal law positions, and so many states, some states, I think even Malaysia has moved towards explicit criminalization. And yeah.
Thank you. And shall we go to Dishani now?
Thank you, Kaushi. Hello, Rahul, I'm Dishani, and my question is based on the experiences that I have with working with communities who live away from Colombo. And I have met many youth and women who are questioning their sexual identities, who are still in their teenage years or they are still schooling. So sometimes they are questioning their identities, and sometimes they come up to me for their solutions. So what I tell them is I very kindly explain to them that it's them who have to make the choice. But sometimes they have told me that, why don't you explain some things to me, because you are exposed to the world and you know many things, and that's their understanding of me. So how do you be available for people who are questioning their sexual identities without intruding into their personal choices? That's my question.
Wow, that's a tough one. It's a very difficult one. And I think you probably have much more experience navigating this kind of question and situation. So I'm also interested to hear how you deal with it. I think your instinct, at least what I heard, is you're very reluctant to impose a choice, right, on somebody else. You want people to make a choice. Exactly. And I think we want people to make informed choices. So perhaps the approach is to provide information about what people in other places do, to provide support, to maybe enable that support in places where it doesn't exist, by perhaps channeling resources, whether material resources or listening resources. There are different ways in which that support can be provided to widen the sphere of choice so that people have more room in which to articulate or to arrive at something that they find more emancipatory. I think that's a more respectful way of helping than imposing or suggesting that. So I think you're right to kind of be hesitant when people ask for a solution or ask for, sometimes maybe people might even put us up on a pedestal and say, oh, you have so much experience, you tell me what to do. I don't know. I don't have the same experience as the person I'm talking to. And I may not even know their context very well. Certainly when I was doing work in Uganda, I always thought, look, I'm an outsider. There are certain things that I cannot and should not say. And my intervention is more about, trying to give Ugandans a sense of the stories that they are already telling themselves. It's not my job to adjudicate or to say this is right and that is wrong, but more to be a curator, to collect the stories so that people can see what the options are and then make their own choice on the basis of that information. So I think that's how I would approach it. I don't know, how do you manage this situation when you're...
Yeah, no, it sounds like a good suggestion, Rahul, because all this time I didn't want, as you said, I didn't want to impose my opinions on them. But then again, I'm like the only outsider to their communities. They are very open to me. So I wouldn't want to break that relationship either, because it's a very personal thing. I cherish it more than anything else. But at the same time, I wouldn't want them to be, 10 years later, I wouldn't want them to see me as someone who, enforce things to them. So I think helping them to make informed choices might be the best thing to go, because I have to be concerned about their families as well, because I wouldn't want them to be abandoning their communities and going away simply like that, because what if they regret it later? Yeah, like you said.
I think listening to you, I'm also thinking that in probably your being an outsider is very helpful to them, because maybe they can tell you things that they don't tell people in their community.
Others. Yeah, so I think perhaps like you said, I should be more informed myself before helping them. So yeah, that might be a very good starting point. Thank you very much, Rahul.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dishani. We'll go to Hasana and then Ephraim.
Thanks, Kaushi. This question relates to what Rahul was saying earlier, so I speak now, Ephraim. Hope you don't mind. Yes, so we were talking about this Homo Capitalism. I don't know whether this really connects to it. So, so when it comes to some of the queer activists, they come from really marginalized communities. They're poverty and they don't have jobs. They struggle a lot. They can't live with their families. We know all the struggles that they go through, right? So when they come out, fight for their rights, then they set up few collectives or groups or some organizations. So now what happens in Sri Lanka is, so there are few groups where, so they need money to live. They need money as an earning for everything, right? Especially during this COVID time. So there is lots of fund coming from nationalist diaspora group, right? So the imposition of their ideologies through giving funding, how that shapes, but these people, sometimes they're aware of it, sometimes they are not aware of it. I'm not criticizing them in a bad way, but to understand how we can respond to these situations. Or maybe, I know you don't have you might not have answer for everything, but we can think together as from the community, right? So on one side, there's the nationalist diaspora with these nationalist ideas, they are funding. On the other side, from center, there's lots of neoliberal organization funding these groups in the peripheries, and they impose their ideas, okay, like the donor project thing, like do this, and they need just money, they will do some workshops, okay, they will organize, they take the money and go. But how these ideologies, as Kiran always said, now I am also used to that, these Peruvian scholar Aníbal Quijano, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly, though colonialism, like, it's the ruling is not there now, how we live and our ideas is still based on colonial ways, right? So how do we, when we have this consciousness, how do we support the community when we clearly know that there's lots of right-wing politics, nationalist politics playing just merely because of this money that we need to live? And you can't blame the people, the community ones. They are the ones who are suffering a lot on one side. So how do we balance this And we don't have money from the ones who are supporting that much of money also, right? So I just want to share that as a reflection from what's happening now. Yeah.
Well, this is definitely one we have to think about together, because it's a familiar issue in India with the amount of Hindu right-wing diasporic money that pours in through RSS charities and the whole Sangh Parivar network of organizations is very good at channeling money in this way. And you're right, people who are desperate for money will take it from anywhere they can get it. I think there are two issues here. One is, first of all, are people aware? So just making people aware is, I think, is a service. There is value in doing that, right? It's similar to what I was saying to Dishani. I think giving people an awareness of options and of what they're getting into is really important. Then the other question I would ask is, what are the terms on which money is given? Right? Sometimes it comes with quite explicit strings. If you want this funding, you have to do X, Y, Z. And again, that's something people have to be aware of, so that they at least go into the transaction with their eyes wide open, rather than being caught unawares later. And then you have to ask the very difficult question, are we willing to accept these terms? Or are we losing something in doing so? Sometimes the situation is such an emergency that you just say, okay, sometimes I think we entertain the hope that we can take the money and do whatever we want with it, and not have to worry too much about what the funder is wanting. That doesn't always work. I can see Dishani nodding head. It doesn't always work, right? But I think sometimes we delude ourselves thinking, okay, I'll take the money and do what I want. But so the terms on which the money is offered, I think, are really important. If there is a possibility of renegotiating the terms, sometimes that can be an important intervention. One can say to the donor, okay, we're not always in a position to do that, but sometimes that, I think, might be a third option in this situation. So I think it depends on the power balance, right? How vulnerable are the recipients? How powerful are the donors? This is always what shapes these conversations.
Yeah.
And yeah, sometimes the only ethical thing to do is to walk away, but sometimes people are so vulnerable that ethics is a luxury. So there's that also.
Just occurring, can the subaltern speak? Again, another topic.
Can the subaltern speak? My attitude towards that, I mean, I love that article. It's really important. But I think partly what Spivak is saying, in a later interview, she says, I never said the subaltern could not talk. The subaltern is talking all the time. I said the subaltern cannot speak. And that is a different thing, because speech is about intelligibility. Speech means you must have an interlocutor who can understand what you're saying. So when I read that interview, I thought, actually, maybe the article should have been called, Can the Bourgeois Theorist Hear? Not Can the Subaltern Speak? Because it's more about the powerful person understanding rather than the less powerful person speaking.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Ephraim, sorry for keep you waiting for so long.
That's fine.
And Ephraim, you're okay with me recording? We're still recording.
Yeah. You may have to reconsider after I share my story. It may be a little scandalous. The way I sort of fell into activism wasn't as altruistic as Hasana's and Siva's stories. This was, I guess, back in like 2017, 2018, when basically I was getting bored with Grindr, and there was in a sense of constant. There were certain things that I was trying to escape from what I was doing on Grindr, and I was like looking for newer boys to hook up with, yes, thank you, Hasna. Yes, Grinders and app that's used by mostly gay men and trans people and bisexual men as well. And a friend of mine told me about this film screening, this queer film screening that was happening once a month, and I was just curious about who is going there, whom can I connect with, and the first time I went there, I can't remember what the film was, but it didn't really sort of resonate with me, and I felt a little alienated there as well. And I volunteered to host next film, and once again, I guess my selection of film this time didn't resonate with the others, and I impressed absolutely no one. No one wanted my number. it was it was a reckoning, I guess.
Which film were you suggesting?
Sebastian by Jared Diamond, and it was a little too raunchy for the prudent queer people in Colombo. But I made lots of friends, and I guess that is the strength of that particular experience. And one of those people that I met was this Maldivian boy that later in, I guess, around 2017, 2018, he had to run away from his parents because he had been outed by another friend of his, and they were going to send him to conversion therapy in Maldives. And among our friends, we among the community itself and friends, we were able to help him temporarily, but this wasn't clearly, there was no way that we could sustain this effort. And which is what and this person who had to run away, he also was very crucial in solidifying these ideas and us, that the need for emergency support for queer people. And as things progressed, we were able to find some sort of stability for this person through our own networks, but also we eventually ended up setting up this organization that provides rapid response relief for queer people. Kaushi actually was very instrumental in that establishing that organization. And during the pandemic, I guess it has been it is definitely one of the more sort of prouder things that I've done, despite going to a place only to hook up with people. Yeah, and from that point onwards, I was sort of involved with the community a little more hands-on, I guess. But I guess the next part of sort of my gender justice, as the question framed it, was this art piece that I did in again in I think in 2018 and 2019. This is when the Australian, in the debate about marriage equality, was becoming prominent in Australia. And like you mentioned, I was saying organizations like World Bank, Apple, Qantas as sort of like spearheading this movement, and this sort of like made me reconsider how I thought about marriage itself. And this particular this piece that I made was just like a pamphlet that's given. It was a little performative, but it was also textual and visual. And it was exhibited then in an exhibition here in Colombo. And yeah, that also sort of like solidified some sense of self in me. Following this process of thinking through marriage, trying to make a tangible piece out of my opinions, sort of helped me with that. And last year, not year before last, when the presidential election was happening, in my household, the most politically active person. My household, as in my parents' house, the most politically active person in the house was my mother's brother. But he still holds an Indian passport, and he can't vote. And until that point, all my votes I had sort of cancelled because of lack of faith in the electoral system, I guess. And this time I felt like that there is something that I know that my uncle can't vote, and I know that he is definitely a lot more invested in the politics and experience the politics of this country a lot more than I have in my short time. And luckily for me, during this presidential election, the queer community had sort of made efforts to enter the mainstream political arena, and some of our friends and I, we were able to write a manifesto for one of the movements that had entered national politics, and I sort of used that as an in to talk about who I'm voting for in this presidential election with my uncle. And it was a very sort of I don't know, it just brought the sense of home closer to me through my uncle that had just been in the periphery of my life. And that moment, that conversation and what came out of that conversation is something that I cherish a lot. And I guess in a way it falls within the category of gender justice. In terms of challenges, the one that I had noted down to bring up was what Hasana had already mentioned, the sort of vacillation between depending on donor grants, which is like the very end of the neoliberal capitalist process, and on the other hand, relying on ad hoc donor interventions through the diaspora, and you had sort of addressed that. But here, I guess this isn't really a problem, but something that I have noticed is that in this, like Hasna had said, in this sort of moments of desperation where people really need to just support themselves, one thing that I have noticed that these moments sort of capitulate people to become personalities in the movement itself, and this personality is usually larger than life, and then sustaining this larger than life personality in itself becomes like a very sort of difficult game and tiring thing that one has to do, which I suppose I find interesting, and even though it doesn't register to me as like a problem, but I know other people think of it as a problem. But yeah, thank you.
What a tremendous like a journey almost you've narrated, I think, from Grindr to an intervention in the presidential election. I think that's really wonderful, actually, the different moments in that journey and the kind of different spaces and interventions that it's produced. So I'm very interested in many things there. The first is the kind of relationship between online and offline spaces, I think is really interesting, because it could be interesting to think through what each of those things are good for, right? Online space can be a refuge for people who are struggling with many things. It offers safety, anonymity. I mean, I'm saying this out of personal experience. Many of us came out for the first time online in some kind of chat room or something like that, right? Many of our first expressions of sexuality happen in this way. The online space can also be very uncomfortable. That very same anonymity can license a whole range of behaviors that would not happen in face-to-face, or I hope would not happen in face-to-face situations in the same way. So and we all know this from our use of social media, it has potential, but it can also go very badly wrong. And I think that's interesting. The other dynamic may be, there's this whole critique about how online queerness has killed offline spaces. You hear this very much in Western cities where real estate costs and gentrification have basically, has led to the closure of many queer clubs. And this process is exacerbated by the fact that people now meet online and in their houses rather than coming to a kind of social space. And that, I think, makes us also, help us, make us think about what happens to queer sociality. This is not what you're describing. I'm just juxtaposing your description with certain dynamics that play themselves out in a city like London, for example. So sometimes the online can really aid the creation of offline spaces. And other times, I think the online can undermine the creation and the sustenance of offline spaces. And I think it could be interesting to think about both those dynamics. I was interested in what you said about marriage. And I think this is obviously a big question for many of us in many situations, whether we want it or we don't want it. We're all supposed to have some kind of attitude towards it, right? It's sort of there in society as a social institution that is kind of inescapable. So in Western queer theory, there's long been a critique of the focus on marriage as the goal to strive for. And queer critics see this as, a heteronormative institution, an oppressive institution. And the critique is, why should we hanker for inclusion in an institution which is so oppressive? Instead, we should simply, so this also goes back to the question of inclusion. Some kinds of inclusion are necessary and worth fighting for. Others might be counterproductive if we become like them. Let me just use those phrases loosely for now. But I've been thinking about this differently, also reading Dalit political thought and Dalit work, right? So Ambedkar's work on annihilation of caste, the recognition of intercaste marriage is very central for him as a priority. It's a way of breaking caste. Marriage is what he thinks. He uses the word marriage. We don't have to use the word marriage. We can think of any kind of intercaste affiliation or relationship. Is what breaks caste for him and for many Dalit activists today as well. In Periyar, of course, from Tamil Nadu, pioneered the self-respect movement, which was also about crafting new forms of relationship and affiliation and marriage, also with the intention of breaking caste. So I think in South Asian political thought, there has been some really interesting radical thinking around the question of marriage. Not saying, oh, marriage is it's a gone case, let's not even go there, but actually thinking very imaginatively about the potential of marriage, affiliation, relationships. I'm not wedded to marriage, right? I'm just thinking more generally about relationships as the way in which hierarchies and boundaries might be dissolved. So I think there's a conversation to be had about that, which I suspect in South Asia will look a bit different from the way it unfolds in Euro-American queer theory. And then you talked about challenges, and I think one of the really interesting ones you talked about is, so part of what does it take to be a successful fundraiser, right? Even when we're engaged in very good and progressive work. Sometimes what it takes, I think you said people become personalities, it's a full-time job. And I see that in many different places. I read a book about the Ugandan movement, which suggested, this is by a scholar called S.M. Rodriguez, and the book is called The Economies of Queer Inclusion. Again, terms that we've been talking about today. And they argue that, a certain elite level of leadership in the queer movement became more interested in relationships with the donors than in their relationships with the grassroots. And so the full-time job, as you describe it, became servicing relationships with the external donor rather than representing the community and this, I think, is a very familiar dynamic. And it doesn't just happen in queer activism, it happens in all kinds of activism. And I think that's when maybe it begins to become a problem or begins to create tensions within the community, because it also leads to divisions, to a kind of, sometimes to jealousy, to turf wars, to, you know, all of these different dynamics, but also to a kind of alienation, maybe when people are no longer responding to what's happening there and are thinking about a different set of priorities. This is not to blame individuals. What I'm trying to describe is the structure, the global political economy in which we live. You know, it kind of forces us to begin doing these things, and then maybe takes us away from the things that originally motivated us, at least some of us. I think this is something that I've noticed.
Thank you, Rahul. Do we have any more questions? Okay, if there are no other questions, I would like to go to a more broader questions with Rahul. Like one of the things that we have been discussing so far is we have actually planned to discuss it later, but then I think we discussed it already, like what are the most pressing issues for queer activists, and especially we discussed about Sri Lankan activists. Would you like to have a little break, or yeah, maybe like 10 minutes, 10, 15
Sorry, how long? 10 minutes, 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Or
It's 7 in Sri Lankan time. Maybe we'll meet at 7:15.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Talking about desire, this way of talking about desire originated in a very particular context. So if we read Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, he says this way of talking about desire originates in the 19th century in Europe, when particular, you know, ways of understanding desire begin to be articulated in medicine and psychiatry and law and literature and so forth. And then as a way of talking about desire, it spreads to other parts of the world through colonialism, through the, you know, through the funding, through HIV/AIDS funding in particular, through the operations of the media, popular culture. These ways of identifying begin to express themselves in other places as well. So now, that's not to say that they are illegitimate because they originate in some part of the world, because we are constantly borrowing ideas from other places. We take what we think is useful and emancipatory, and perhaps we don't take the things that are not. But I think a decolonial approach to sexuality has to constantly ask that question: what is useful and what is not? And be prepared not to innovate, not to accept everything that comes with that package, you know? Because I feel like a certain at the moment LGBT rights seems to come as a kind of package, particularly when it comes to thinking about frameworks for emancipation. It's about identity, it's about particular forms of organizing, it's about a particular set of priorities. And I think a decolonial approach would disaggregate these things and say, okay, what if this package is useful and what is less useful? And how can we craft our own combinations of priorities? And this is what makes queer life unique in different places. And I think that's part of what we have to think through and to nourish and to nurture and to celebrate. Another thing that I think a decolonial approach to sexuality has to do, and maybe this is a less popular thing to say, is that postcolonial and decolonial theory has to pay attention to how power is shifting in the world, right? Power is moving around. New kinds of players and actors are becoming powerful. New hierarchies are being created. States that were former colonies are now very obviously imperial and colonial in their own right. I'm thinking particularly of India, and because that's what I know best, but I'm thinking of, occupation of Kashmir. I'm thinking of long-running secessionist movements in Nagaland and elsewhere, which have never recognized the Indian state as a democratic state. I'm thinking of the way in which India positions itself geopolitically as a rising power, as an emerging great power, etc., etc. For a long time, post-colonial theory, I think, and decolonial theory has mostly been about tracing the continuities of historic colonialism in the present. But what about these new colonialisms? And I'm not just talking about neo-colonialism. You know, the term neo-colonialism is often used to describe economic imperialism, the forms of Western imperialism that persist. I'm not just talking about that. I'm also talking about, frankly, new colonialisms of India, China, whatever, right? A decolonial approach to sexuality has to be able to follow this moving target. We have to be able to map how power is shifting in the world, who are the new imperialists, what is our attitude towards them, what problems does this create in the world. And that doesn't mean that the old colonialism is less relevant, but it takes us to this very difficult, messy question, which is whenever we confront a particular social reality, how do we apportion blame between colonialism and post-colonialism? Usually it's a combination of these things, right? It's both the colonial state and the things it leaves behind, and it's the post-colonial state and the things that it has done. Sometimes, you know, embracing colonial laws and governmentality, as we've seen, sometimes creating new things. How do we have that more complicated conversation about who is responsible for the current state of affairs? Because first we need that diagnosis before we can think about how to get out of it, how to think ourselves out of it. So for me, these are some of the priorities, and you know, it's a moving thing. It's not static, and probably the answers to this question have to keep changing as the world changes. And but I think that's where I'm at the moment when I think about this.
Thank you, Rahul. I think it's an important point you raised, that not to agree to the whole package, but, you know, finding, I think in a way that individuals do it, but we don't actually see that. For example, in my research, one of the things I have noticed about the sex workers in Sri Lanka, especially trans sex workers, that, you know, they, the NGOs who support them are trying to get them out of sex work, right? So one thing is sex work is considered as illegal in Sri Lanka, but that is not the case, because especially, you know, the women's sexuality is considered as a, you know, controlled periphery and a taboo. And a lot of the NGOs fund to kind of provide some skills work, right? Like sewing, painting, makeup, instead of doing sex work. And then when I interviewed some of the NGOs that who provide those kind of support, and they said that, you know, there's a say in Sinhala that frogs cannot be kept on the mattress. They go back to their, you know, the old habitats. So likewise, sex workers cannot be reformed. So that is, I found it very disturbing that it is kind of coming from, you know, funded projects, especially the projects that are funded, operated with the government sector, along with the government sector. But at the same time, those sex workers, they have created their own spaces. Yes, they get, you know, free condoms, free, you know, healthcare support, free HIV testing. But at the same time, they know that these organizations have, you know, certain kind of frame that you are supposed to adhere to, and they just don't adhere to. They just take their cut, and then you know, create their own little spaces, hidden spaces, where they can, you know, share things, give support to each other. I'm not saying that that space is also kind of, you know, fully emancipated space, but still there are spaces. For example, during the COVID-19 situation, a lot of the organizations were not being able to support these sex workers because they lost their jobs. But at that time, many of the supports were coming from their own spaces, through their friendships and, you know, romantic relationships, etc. So I think the way they take it is kind of unseen we don't see there are little spaces in their lives. I just wanted to add that to what you said. We have one question from Ephraim. Could you speak about what anti-capitalism is, could be in practice? And Kiran adds to that, I was also thinking we should speak about the relationship between anti-capitalism and decoloniality. Would you like to respond to that, Rahul?
Yeah, it's a really big question. There's no single answer to that, right? It depends on the context. So in the context of COVID, what does anti-capitalism mean? I think in the context of COVID, anti-capitalism means patent waivers for a vaccination, right? It's about prioritizing the public good over profit. And what is ironic about these vaccinations is that so many of them have been developed with public funding in the first place. So what we have here is a model in which the risk of developing the vaccination is borne by society as a whole, but the profit is siphoned off by pharmaceutical companies and manufacturers and so on, right? So anti-capitalism in the context of COVID would mean patent waivers. It would mean mutual aid, of course, which is already happening, but it would also mean the state providing aid in a much bigger way than it has. I'm thinking about the first wave of COVID in India, especially the situation of the migrant workers in that moment, where people with 4 hours notice, a lockdown was declared, and people were just left to do what? They didn't have a roof over their heads. They had to go back to their villages. They had to trek for hundreds of kilometers. They died on the way. It was, this is the state abdicating a basic responsibility. It doesn't even require socialism. Actually, it requires a functioning state in the first place, which, a minimal social compact, even that is not something that is in evidence at the moment, at least in India. But as I say, it depends on the context. In the context of queer movements, it might go back to, I think Ephraim brought up this very important thing about emergency support, right? Solidarism, right? How does the community share resources? What kinds of support structures can we build for people who are vulnerable? Do we want to be a queer community that champions individual achievement and becoming a dynamic citizen and participant in the market? Or are we thinking about a queer movement that is actually creating welfare and safety nets for people who are left behind? I think this often gives us some very stark questions and choices that we have to make up our minds about. Where do we want to put our energy? I think that anti-capitalism will look different in that context. On a more kind of macro scale, I think about potential alliances and solidarities between, for example, movements against displacement and queer movements. What is the connection? There are lots of interesting connections. People who've done work on Adivasis and sexuality have talked about how the destruction of Adivasi life worlds, of indigenous life worlds, has actually heteronormalized societies that are quite queer in the first place, right? So capitalism can sometimes transform our subjectivities in directions that make us more and more heteronormal, right? In pushing us in the direction of nuclear families, of homemakers and breadwinners, and this is the image of family life that a lot of World Bank projects have perpetuated and supported. The bank is not the only guilty actor here, but it's a particularly good example, I think. In my book, I have a reading of a film which you might be interested in. Some of you may know Jayan Cherian. He's a filmmaker originally from Kerala, and he has this beautiful film called Papillary Buddha, which is a fictional film. It's a story of a land struggle in a fictional Dalit settlement in Wayanad in Kerala. And it's a story about displacement, about caste, about queerness, all these things are happening in the same place. For me, this evokes the kind of image that Hasana was also talking about, these different groups coming together and having to think about all their issues in the same place. It's not a very didactic film, there's no massive sort of moral of the story or lesson or anything like that. But I think what is so powerful about this film is that it shows us how these things are connected, how we can talk about these things together, how they are not separate, how they are part of the same struggles and life worlds. And that to me is a very, very powerful symbol of what a possible anti-capitalism could look like. I don't know if Jayan would even call himself an anti-capitalist or call this film an anti-capitalist film, but I think maybe he would. Yeah.
Thank you, Rahul. We have a question from Siva.
I think we moved a bit from the about that discussion, but I just want to briefly mention a discussion that I and Johanna recently had after the summer school. So we were thinking what decolonial thought is, and Johanna mentioned that even before coloniality, there was slavery. So Rahul is talking about, how decolonial thought, it has to, it's a process, or it has to incorporate the new forms of, power, or different new forms of structures that are becoming powers. There's a change in that. So I also wanted to reflect, even though we predominantly talk about coloniality and things happened after that and what's happening right now, but at the same time in indigenous communities, slavery in different other forms still exist, and it could be existing within our communities as well. So just wanted to mention that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I fully agree. So not only talking about new imperialisms, but also about pre-colonial imperial formations and pre-colonial forms of hierarchy. The caste system is a great example of that, right? It's institutionalized slavery, appropriation of labor, and it's institutionalized control of gender and sexuality. Ambedkar has this very famous essay where he says, what is caste? Caste is nothing but endogamy. So his definition of caste is the same as the control of gender and sexuality. And that, I think, reminds us also of older forms of rigid gender normativity, which cannot simply be laid at the door of British colonialism or,
Siva's question brings back to Rahul's argument about Ugandan Anti-Gay Law again, that you describe that Ugandan nationalists have said that there are no homosexuals in Uganda, whereas that tension. Would you like to talk a little bit about that, because I think it's relevant here, Rahul?
Sure. So when I was thinking about the Ugandan Anti-Homosexuality Act, one it's a very common phrase that we hear is homosexuality is Western, right? This is articulated in Uganda, India, I'm sure Sri Lanka as well, many places. So the queer activist response and the queer academic response has often been, sorry, it's not homosexuality that's Western, it's homophobia that's Western, because you people brought colonial penal codes. And also when we talk about the Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act, the involvement of these American evangelical Christians is pointed to as evidence that the West has brought homophobia to Africa, Asia, etc. This is partly true, but it's not fully true, I think, because to go back to the discussion just now, we have to think about pre-colonial forms of intolerance and also post-colonial forms of intolerance. So the law might have been given to us by the British colonial penal codes, but our post-colonial states have happily embraced these laws, given them new life, kept them on the statute books for decades, right? So it's not open to us 70 odd years after independence to say, we're still struggling with just a colonial legacy. It is that, but it is also our post-colonial chauvinists and religious fundamentalists who have helped keep these laws in place. So with the Ugandan Act, I'm trying to tell a story of how these kinds of legislations are the combination of colonial and post-colonial intolerance. And I'm trying to show how these work hand in glove with each other. And I try to do this by telling a long story from the late 19th century to the early 21st century, not exhaustive, but I look at 2-3 different moments where you can see Ugandan elites and Western elites working in close collaboration with each other. Or benefiting from each other in some sense. Even if they don't work with each other, it suits, Hindu right-wing fundamentalists in India, for example, to say that queerness is what Muslims do, which is what the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra used to talk like that. So there's this constant othering and displacement, I think, at work, and it operates on so many different levels. And to try and tell a story of these transnational alliances of phobia and hatred, I think that's what I was that was one of the most important objectives in the book.
Thank you, Rahul. Kiran has raised her hand. Kiran?
Yeah, I mean, I have a million different questions, but I mean, just to pick up on the last point that you were making, Rahul, I mean, that was one of the things I found really inspiring in that Locations of Homophobia article that we've shared a part of for this week's required reading, that the way in which you navigate that question of how do we think about agency and complicity in different places, rather than just projecting it constantly onto whether it's the West created homosexuality or the West created homophobia. And I was thinking maybe one question to both you and Kaushi is how, because I think this is something you've both dealt with in your work, and I'm also thinking of Naisagi Dev's book about lesbian activists in India, about the challenge, and maybe also some of the activists in this space will also have a response to this. The challenge between, on the one hand, connecting to global discourses, like LGBT rights, human rights discourses, and on the other hand, this kind of challenge to develop an authentic local version, like something that doesn't get rejected as just being, you're just selling out to the West, but also that does take seriously the fact that sometimes the Western lenses or frameworks or languages don't necessarily automatically fit. So I'm wondering how you think about that challenge. From your research, Rahul, Kaushi, how that came through in your work, and then maybe Ephraim and others, if you'd like to say something about that.
Kaushi, you want to go first?
No, after you.
I think it goes back to what I was thinking about when I was saying that queerness is not a package, right? It's a bundle of forms of gender performance, identity, ideas about normativity, the good life, right? It comes to us as a bundle, but we can actually disaggregate that bundle and choose the elements of it that are useful. So I'm not a nativist. I'm not the kind of person who says, oh, because LGBT identities originated in San Francisco or here or there, they become illegitimate when people appropriate them. I think the whole story of emancipation can be told as one in which ideas originate somewhere and are picked up and travel and they do useful work somewhere else. So I don't want to say that so I'm not even thinking about the global and the local here. I'm thinking about different locales in conversation with each other. Of course, some are more powerful and they get called global, but actually that's all we are. We are a bunch of different locales that are in this unequal conversation. And so I think if we have the ability to disaggregate this bundle of queerness and to take what works and what doesn't, and discard what doesn't, then we might be able to think about, this dialectic that you described between the global and the local. how that works out in particular places, I'm trying to think of a compelling example, but actually queerness everywhere is slightly different from everywhere else, right? Or quite different in some cases, the forms of identification, the way in which newer identities relate to older ones, right? So we might think, for example, about how Hijra identities relate to trans identities. It's a complex space, and these different identities have different geographical and historical provenances, but they are also sitting with each other, working with each other, part of a common space now. And for me, that is an interesting example. It exemplifies actually the ways in which global and local ideas have come to be articulated together to produce new forms of community, new kinds of identification, solidarity. I think of somebody like Revati, who's one of the most well-known trans activists in Bangalore, where I'm from, who, some of her books she identifies as Hijra, some of her books she identifies as trans, and she's constantly thinking about her movement between these different spaces, between the space of the Jamaat, the traditional Hijra institutions that govern the community, but also the more secular civil society, modern spaces of transness and trans activism. And in her life writing, none of these spaces are straightforwardly emancipatory and unproblematic. All of them have different issues and struggles, and she's telling a story of moving between them. But they both exist in Bangalore next to each other. They exist in the same place. And that for me is an illustration of how these bundles can get disaggregated and new bundles are created from these different sources and materials.
I would like to add to that. Kiran, I really don't know whether I have an answer, but I would like to bring up one of my observations through my activism to this. I mean, as much as any other country, we have that, as human rights activists, we have that criticism. So, okay, you are getting funded by NGOs, and we are called as, Western conspiracy. Bringing Western conspiracy, and also we are called as dollar crows, dollar kaka in Sinhala, like dollar crows. So that's obviously there. And if you talk in any other like liberal space, when you talk about human rights and feminism or LGBTIQ rights, you will get accused by all nationalists. But that I have experienced. But when Ephraim, Siva, and we were a part of one of the leftist coalition in Sri Lanka. So that leftist coalition in last presidential election, the leader, he publicly, talked for LGBTIQ rights, for abortion, and also we kind of, talked freely about, feminist, leftist feminism, left feminism. And there I feel like we did not receive that. We actually talked about the same thing. I mean, not we were talking about equal rights, but the response we got from nationalists was different to the response we got in any other space, in an NGO or like rights-based, any other activism. But I really don't know the reason, but this is just an observation. Where we stand is also maybe matters. Maybe that they think that we don't have a financial benefit, or I don't know. But I should say it was sort of accepted as a progressive leftist stance towards sexuality, gender, in that context. I really don't know why. Maybe I have to think why the response were different. And maybe we were the same people who were talking about LGBTIQ rights in a different space and getting different response. But I think in the left space, we did not receive that much adverse kind of negative response from the public. Anyone else want to add anything on that? Maybe.
Yeah, just one memory that I have. Like at the last decolonial school, when we went on the day excursion, when we went to the temple at last, there was a massive fair, and Sivadarshini and we went mad over this, like really erotic sculptures on those there. And I was just thinking the sort of decolonial and non-native position of finding your space also could be moments that you like come together and with your friend experience something that, you know, a kid from Colombo and a student from Peradeniya coming together, that just one moment. Maybe there is now questions of how do we sustain those moments. Those are definitely something that even I have to think further. But yeah, these even moments, I think, can shed some light.
Thank you, Eve. Can we move on to the next question, or do you want anybody wants to respond to that? Pavitra has a question. Pavitra, do you want to go?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Kaushi. I feel like my question is quite, might take us to a different discussion, but Rahul, my question is based on your previous statement. I think it is also coming from my background. I'm from an international relations background also. So when you were talking about new colonialisms, and you ended that conversation saying that the most critical question that we need to ask is in terms of these new colonialisms is actually who is responsible for these new colonialisms like India and China, etc. So I'm really interested to know, what do you think as to who is responsible for these new colonialisms? Like very brief thoughts if you have.
Yeah, I was actually asking the who is responsible question in a broader sense, in the sense that whatever social realities we confront, how do we apportion responsibility between the colonial and the post-colonial? So it wasn't so much who is singularly responsible. Often I think you cannot give a singular answer. You cannot point a finger and say this or that. The answers are usually much more complicated. It's a combination of colonial legacy and what the post-colonial state has done. But if you're asking the question in a much more contemporary frame, like where we are right now, then answering the question requires us to diagnose where does power lie in the society, right? How is power distributed in a particular society? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? What is driving a particular state project? What are the social forces that uphold that state project? So if I were to ask that question in the Indian context, we would have to ask obviously the facts of the BJP's political dominance are very clear. There's no great analysis one needs to do to point that out. But I think the more interesting question is, what are the social forces that sustain its hegemony? And that requires an analysis of the groups, the castes, the electoral alliances that have been created, the understanding the depth of support that the Hindu right commands, and why, right? Coming to grips with why people support, why this kind of populism is popular. And this is a similar question to what I was asking in Uganda. Why are these kinds of moral panics around sexuality? Why are they so politically popular? Why do politicians have an interest in creating these moral panics? People often say that these moral panics are created to distract the population from bad governance. But the more important question is, why does the population get distracted? Why do people buy the stories that elites tell them? What social anxieties are they tapping into that these crazy fake news stories end up seeming to provide a solution to? Sorry, I don't mean to use crazy in a disparaging way, but what I'm trying to get at is sometimes the narratives look self-evidently false, and yet they are still very powerful, right? I'm just thinking about the memes that circulate in our WhatsApp groups, for example. For me, this is like a daily occurrence. what is it that makes those memes or messages popular, even if they seem to contradict the weight of evidence that the media or scientific research or whatever is giving us? That for me is a really interesting question, and maybe it takes us slightly away from your question, which is who's responsible. But I want to also say the question of why are they so successful is very important for us to think about.
Thanks, Rahul.
Thank you, Rahul. Krishan is asking a question from me, I guess. Entering to the mainstream politics is the reason for the different response you got in the previous presidential election. I really don't know the answer for that, Krishan. I think that we were actually expecting more backlash because being pro left but pro LGBT and queer left is, we all thought that it's gonna come back with a lot of responses, negative responses, but it wasn't. It was sort of accepted. I'm really not sure why the mainstream, why is that? But I think we need to sort of mainstream all these queer and LGBTQ rights, because in the mainstream politics, people don't talk about it. People don't talk about women's body, women's sanitary and all. It's like recently it came to the fore. So that's what I can say, because I think we really need to bring the discussions out of the liberal NGO space, not completely out. I mean, like maybe to mainstream the ideas of rights rather than keeping them for projects in particular organizations. I think it's really a must that we need to do. If any of the others have no questions, I think we can wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts? Rahul, do you have anything to say at the end, or do you any of the others want to ask a question quickly before we wrap up? Okay, looks like nobody has questions. Yes, Rahul.
No, just to say, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's been very wide-ranging. I've enjoyed hearing about your work and the things that are, interesting and preoccupying you. I've learned a lot in the conversation, and I hope it's been interesting for everyone as well. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Rahul. Hasana?
Yes, Kaushi, thank you. Just one more last question maybe to Rahul. Would you like to share something that you really enjoy doing, just to relax our mind before we go, just to know a little bit more about from these theories? Just something simple that you like to do?
You mean just like for fun in life?
Life.
Yeah.
Have 3-hour discussions with us online.
Oh, I really love eating Sichuan food. I've been eating a lot of Chinese food recently. I mean, I don't know, partly in lockdown, I've become bored of my cooking. So I've been enjoying food, I think, and I like cooking new stuff.
Thank you very much.
No, that's very interesting. Everything is from China, including the food now. In Sri Lanka, it's like people speak Chinese now. Right. And thank you very much, Rahul, for your time. 3 hours. We took your whole afternoon with us. And thank you, everyone, joining for this interesting discussion. Our next class is on 5th June, Saturday. But before we finish the session, I would like to quickly show the discussion forum where we post discussions. If you go to Moodle, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you go to Moodle, this is the Moodle homepage. And if you go to dashboard, you can see there's a discussion forum. You can go to discussion forum and then paste any of the questions that you want to raise, and we will be discussing. And you can also post the response in the discussion forum. We have already shared some of the thoughts from previous weeks. Please feel free to use the discussion forum. And thank you again, Rahul, for the interesting discussion. I hope that this will not end today. We will keep bugging you and inviting you, and then maybe we can keep the connection, because we hope to keep the summer school going for the upcoming years too. Thank you very much again, and have a nice discussion, a nice evening to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye, thank you.
Rahul, thank you, Kaushik.